So again, welcome to today's session. I thank you for joining this educational session on awareness and important considerations, mental well-being. My name is Ncaa Hackworth. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I serve as the Director of Inclusion in the Ncaa Office of Inclusion. Mental well-being has always been important, and the past 2+ years has heightened the importance not only of this topic, but just in general, thinking about mental well-being and what does that look like. And particularly, today's conversation will focus on mental well-being for student athletes on our campuses. And we have a phenomenal panel, as well as leaders that are going to be sharing their thoughts with you. And so before we get started with our panel, I would like to introduce our first speaker today, which is Dr. Brian Hayline. He is our Chief Medical Officer here at the Ncaa and Senior Vice President for the Sports Science Institute. Dr. Hayline.
Well, thanks so much, and really a warm welcome to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to touch on a couple of things very, very briefly, but just to remind everyone, in case you haven't heard this story before, when I was on the job, not only 1 week, not even 1 week, almost 10 years ago, I met with the divisional SAC leaders from all 3 divisions, and they all asked independently to make mental health a priority for the Ncaa. And we've heard that, we've responded, and it does indeed remain a considerable priority for us. In fact, I really think it's our #1 priority. That being said, there have been surveys that were done during COVID, and even we were tracking for 3 separate surveys during COVID, because we were very concerned about what was happening now that student athletes were being so disconnected. And we do have several results. I'm not going to go over all of them, but just to suffice it to say that there's still a considerable number of female and male student athletes, and we didn't actually break it down further than that, but who express a sense of even loss of hope. And so it's a considerable number. It's less than 10%, but that's still a very high number. When you have no hope, you don't have much of anything. And the levels of anxiety remain high. The levels of feeling overwhelmed remain high. And some other things that were touched on in the survey that I think are really important is that only a little more than half, say 60% of student athletes really knew how to access mental health care if they needed to. And although some people said, wow, that's a pretty high number, I'm a little disappointed by that, because it really should be 100%. And then also importantly, only about 50% of student athletes said that they would really know how to help a fellow student athlete if that individual was having a mental health concern. And so this gives us a little snapshot into where we are and how we really need to improve. And I'm going to talk about the improvement in a minute. I wanted to take a little sidestep and also just mention to everyone that it was a little more than a month ago that the Ncaa Sports Science Institute, on behalf of the Committee of Competitive Safeguards and Medical Aspects of Sports, that we sent to the entire membership the results of a foundational principles Delphi process that happened in a cultural sensitivity mental health workshop that took place actually during the pandemic. And we specifically focused on student athletes of color. And so in these foundational statements, it was very clear as they were voted on by all of the participants that we need to do a really better job in terms of trying to understand various aspects of cultural sensitivity, especially when it comes to treating athletes of color or the LGBTQ+ community. We need to understand the history of racism and other stereotypes that have been part of sport for many, many years. And we need to have action plans to try to break the barriers that are so prominent sometimes when it has to do with cultural sensitivity and mental health. And so really it was the combination of this survey plus the foundational statements that were put together, and then a more recent meeting with the Committee on Competitive Safeguards. And we looked at what we have available right now, our mental health best practices document, which actually every member school is supposed to be following. That's part of legislation. So it means that every member school is supposed to have identified who their licensed mental health providers are, that they should have rehearsed a routine and emergency mental health plan, that they should be thinking about screening and how to educate to foster an environment that promotes mental well-being. Well, we actually are going to be updating that best practices document. It was last updated in 2020. It's going to incorporate some of the survey data. It's going to incorporate the cultural sensitivity data. We're working with a good representative sample from the membership, plus outside experts, for example, members of the Association of Black Psychologists, the American Psychiatric Association, and so on. And then we expect to have an updated document for you within the year. So that's a little bit of what's happening on mental health, but just to really drive it home on your campus, it should be very, very clear who the providers are, how to access care, and if it's not clear, that actually is a directive that is supposed to be followed, and so it makes all the sense in the world to inquire and figure out how that really can be incorporated into the everyday living of being a student athlete in the Department of in athletics at an Ncaa member school. So again, thanks for the opportunity to be with you, and really looking forward to hearing a great session. So thanks again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hainline. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Lindsay Keenan. I'm an associate professor and athletic trainer in the Department of Sports Medicine at Westchester University. I'm excited to be here today to discuss the incredibly important topic of mental health and wellness in student athletes, something I, and I'm sure many of you, are very passionate about. I'm often asked to define mental wellness and mental health and the differences. Really, there is no difference. Mental or psychological wellness, well-being, or health is the status of an individual's psychological and emotional well-being. This includes the cognitive state, their thinking, and emotional state, their feelings, that a person experiences. And it exists on a continuum in which we fluctuate daily. On one end is wellness, and the other, mental health distress or disorders. Many of us experience distress at some points in our lives, but when a person, or in this case, a student athlete, experiences distress or mental health concerns that affect their daily life, including school and sport, it can become problematic and difficult to cope with. Additionally, as Dr. Hainline mentioned, research has shown student athletes, and in particular athletes of color, are less likely to seek help and utilize mental health services. The stigma associated with mental health and individual culture can sometimes deter a student athlete from asking for help. Thankfully, campuses are moving towards addressing student athlete mental health by utilizing resources and implementing the best practices that Dr. Hainline just mentioned in ways that work for their campus and athletes. These practices can help prevent mental health concerns, identify athletes already in distress, connect athletes to resources, and change the environment and conversation around mental health. And today, our panelists will provide their thoughts, experiences, and best practices that they bring to their campuses. So here's what we want to explore today. Number one, we want to identify mental wellness best practices and discuss those. Number two, highlight the application of mental wellness best practices on our select campuses. Number three, share the student athlete perspective on mental health. Number four, share how the intersection of student athletes' identities may impact how and if they seek support for their mental well-being. And number five, increase the dialogue among all of you, our inclusion forum participants, on the importance of mental wellness best practices. We have assembled a top-notch panel to facilitate our conversation today, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about them. I'll start with our star student athlete, Michaela Boyd, who is a member of the Division II Student Athlete Advisory Committee. Michaela is a current junior soccer student athlete at Palm Beach Atlantic in Palm Beach, Florida. Boyd represents the Sunshine State Conference on National Division II SAC and is an NCAA Division II Women Leaders X Grant recipient. She also serves on the Division II's Implementation Committee and the Association-wide Minority Opportunities and Interest Committee. Majoring in elementary education, she's received multiple academic accolades. She is active on and off the soccer field as she's totaled 1,200 minutes played. Welcome, Michaela. We're also fortunate to have Marquetta Dickens, the head women's basketball coach and ADID for William Peace University. She also currently serves as the chair of the NCAA Minority Opportunities and Interest Committee. Dickens chose to enter the coaching field so that she could impact student athletes' lives the way her coaches had impacted hers during her tenure at NC State. Dickens went on to play professional basketball for 2 years before beginning her collegiate coaching career. In addition to coaching, Dickens has served as the senior women administrator, an assistant AD for student athlete wellness, a private practice psychotherapist, and is also the CEO of a community development corporation in her hometown. Welcome to the panel, Marquetta. And last but certainly not least, with us is Dr. L. Kenneth Chu. Dr. Chu has been the director of the Indiana State University Student Counseling Center since 2007. He received his doctorate from the Virginia Consortium Program in Clinical Psychology in 2001 and completed his undergraduate work at Jamestown College, where he majored in psychology with a minor in fine art. Dr. Chu has received extensive training and professional experiences in the areas of counseling of college students with a specific focus in counseling of athletes, where he has worked with drug and alcohol patients, and he has done clinical and psychoeducational assessments on children, adolescents, and young adults. His professional interests include the counseling of athletes, performance enhancement, drug and alcohol issues, multicultural counseling, facilitation of professional and personal development training, and outreach programming. We are very lucky to have Dr. Chu with us. Thank you. And again, I'm Dr. Lindsay Keenan. I'm an associate professor and athletic trainer in the Department of Sports Medicine at Westchester University in Pennsylvania. I earned my PhD from Temple University in sports psychology and my master's and bachelor's degrees in athletic training. I work clinically as the athletic trainer with our NCAA women's rugby team, and I teach courses in our undergraduate and graduate programs. My research has focused on mental health in student athletes. So along with 2 colleagues and based on our research line, we recently developed an app, Promotion Health, to screen athletes for mental health issues. I am thrilled with the composition of this panel, particularly with the diversity of perspective it offers. Please feel free to submit your questions via the chat throughout today's session. We'll save time at the end to answer as many questions as possible. So let's get started. Michaela, let's start with you. From a student athlete perspective, what is one thing or action that your coaches, athletic directors, and/or athletic trainers have done to address mental health?
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you all for being here today. I'm super excited to speak on this panel. So yeah, let's get into it. So at the beginning of the year, my athletic department holds a meeting with all of the athletes. And within that meeting, there is an explanation of where we can find support for mental health on campus. So where our counseling center is and how we can set up appointments and stuff like that. There's also a beginning of the year wellness survey that all athletes have to take so that when situations arrive, athletic trainers, coaches, and athletic directors have a better idea of the specific athlete's holistic well-being prior to handling the situation, so they can tackle that in a more pointed way. Also, this is specific to my team, but my coach hired a sports psychologist as one of our assistant coaches. So we have access to a woman who has played soccer at an extremely high level, understands the demands of the game, and brings us a new knowledge about how to handle being a student athlete. She gives us advice on how to deal with the highs and the lows that we experience mid-game, how to ride those moments out, and how to recenter ourselves so that we can perform at our ideally highest level. And like I said, that's specific to my team, but that's something that is so amazing that our coach has done, sought out to make sure that we have someone like that as a part of our coaching staff. And that's just been a really great experience for me and my teammates.
That's great. Thank you for sharing, Michaela. You're really lucky to be able to have a coach that has that kind of experience and background for sure. So, Dr. Chu and Marquetta, what is one specific thing or action you have done or been a part of that has helped address student athlete mental health and become a best practice? Dr. Chu, let's start with you.
So when I saw the question, I had to think about, I've done a lot of things over the years, but I can say that the one thing that I would say was the thing that stands out the most for me is that for the first 2 or 3 years that I was at my current job, I did the legwork. So as a psychologist, I made an effort to, connect with the athletic directors, with, visiting each of the coaches, just educating them a little bit about mental health, about performance, reminding them that, wellness was going to be important to some of the goals that they wanted to accomplish. And so, a big part of kind of the earlier part of my career was doing the legwork. And in addition to that, I've continued to do the legwork. So when I've been given opportunities to be the bullhorn, to go out and speak and to advocate for student athlete mental health or to promote the counseling of athletes, I've always taken the time. And even if I don't have time, I've tried to make sure that was something that was emphasized, because for a long time, this was a population that was either overlooked, or there was that misperception that somehow athletes had, they were given everything and they had it easy. Well, no, it's not that simple. And so, but for me, it's that legwork and getting out and trying to educate people as much as possible.
Thank you, Dr. Chu. I agree. And even hearing from Dr. Hainline mention about the number of athletes who often are unaware of resources, it makes me think of the gatekeepers. And I often see athletic trainers in sports medicine as the gatekeepers to healthcare for student athletes. And so it's important that all hands on deck, all stakeholders and gatekeepers to student athlete health are doing that legwork and are being a part of the conversation and coming to the table. Marquetta, how about you?
So I've had the unique role of being both a coach and an administrator. And so, I can kind of talk about one thing I've done in each role. And I'll say the first thing, I guess the most important for me was personally prioritizing my own mental health. And that made it that much more important for me to prioritize it for my student athletes and those around me. And so as a coach, we actually practice physically 5 days a week. And on a 6th day, we dedicate that day to our mental health and wellness. We bring in a sports psychologist or a life coach or some type of mental wellness coach and have those conversations. And we give that space to our team. We do things like yoga meditation on that day. And then we'll go over some more mindless things and X's and O's. And so it's more of it's still basketball, is still practice. They're still engaged, but it's more so focused on the mental wellness and the mental health. And even, sometimes that does kind of fall back to performance for some student athletes. And so we kind of slow it down a little bit on that 6th day to make sure that we're refreshing and we're balancing and kind of refreshing and rebalancing ourselves mentally, because that's the most important piece. That's the foundation. And it's really hard for me to kind of pick to one, because really mental health is something that before I ever became a head coach, I wanted to be a platform for me and champion that issue, because I understand its importance from a personal standpoint and from an educational standpoint with my background and my expertise now. And so as an administrator, it was really, really awesome to work with someone who really gave me free range. And so even at the Division III level, we really focus on mental health in the manner of having a sports psychologist come out and offer offer funding for our programs to have a sports psychologist come in and work with their teams. And so we really put our money and our funding where our priorities were. So I was really excited to be a part of that. And each program walked away with something at least tangible and some type of training. Coaches had individual training as well, and a program to be able to utilize and put their teams through for the remainder of the season. Of course, they can continue to use that program. So those are two things that I've done, both, on the professional and personal kind of standpoint.
That's great. And that's also a great segue into my next question. So we know it's important that safe spaces are created for students to discuss their mental health. And from research, we know that discussion can be more challenging for some students based on their identities. So Marquetta, how do you work with your student athletes to create that safe space to talk about mental health on your team?
Again, I always start with myself. I have to be able to have those conversations myself. And a lot of people aren't willing to have those conversations outside of their team, let alone within their teams. And so some people aren't even having these conversations with their own families. So, I know that's a very difficult space to be. I'm just not one of those people, fortunate for me. So for me, I actually have individual meetings. I have standing meetings with my athletes. We do bi-weekly, out of season, in season. We do weekly. People are like, oh, where their time is ramped up, why more in season? Because they have a lot more on their plate in season, and I need to check in a lot more often. And so we have standing meetings, and that really is for me to build rapport. And honestly, just for me to be my authentic self, for them to be their authentic selves. We don't have a lot of time in practice to go over how you're feeling, how you're doing. In those moments, I can probably seem very dismissive of how they feel. And so I want to be able to meet them in a space to really check in and let them know that I do care and it is important and it does matter, and to make sure that they have the tools to be able to cope when they're not okay and they still have to perform. And so I have better conversations outside of practice than I do in practice. And if I don't hold that space in their schedules, they will definitely fill it with something else. Because, like myself, I did not prioritize my mental health. I will definitely prioritize my social life over my mental health as a college student. And so I want to make sure that we're being strategic with their time and very efficient. And I think that it has, especially for me, being a young head coach, and a newer head coach, these meetings have been instrumental for me to be able to get rapport and buy-in even into system, X's and O's. So I found it to be a great tool to also introduce mental health. And so when we talk about three things, we talk about number one, how are you? How's your family? We also talk about academics, and then we have a space that we hold and talk about basketballs where they can ask me any questions that we break down. And in these conversations, we mostly end up talking about themselves, how they're feeling. And that's when I drop my little nuggets about mental health. They all know my background and my expertise. I don't know if that's why they feel comfortable. And sometimes I never get work done now because when I was the SWA and that was my role, everybody came. It wasn't just my team, and our head coaches were part-time. So I was everybody's head coach. And I really appreciate the level of understanding and the grace and just really the minds of our young people. And I learned a lot, and I still learn a lot from our student athletes. And that's probably why I'm also one of their biggest advocates, and I will forever be, because I once stood in their place as well. So that's something I personally do. Is I also remember that I was once in those shoes, and I didn't always cross every T and dot every I.
Thank you, Marquetta. I can imagine, even though your athletes are aware of your background, that they feel comfortable because of that space that you've created. I've seen that happen in practice from coaches who are willing to maybe even step out of their comfort zone. For you, it's probably a little bit more comfortable than, the coach down the road or a coach in the office next to yours. However, the coaches that I've seen do that and create a space and prioritize mental health, and not just say it, but actually do it, right? Create those spaces, invite them into offices, prioritize, a seminar or webinar on mental health, and encourage the athletes to take part in that and even talk about their personal experiences really has changed the environment. I've seen it happen. So kudos to you for doing that and creating that space for your athletes. So Michaela, as a student athlete woman of color, can you share your experiences around mental health?
Absolutely. So people of color, especially Black and Brown people's mental health has historically not been taken as seriously. There was once a myth that Black women didn't feel the same pain as white women, that they had thicker skin and less sensitive nerves. I'm going to repeat that. There was a myth that Black women did not feel pain the same way as white women. And this misunderstanding of physical pain has bled into a misunderstanding of mental and psychological misunderstanding of pain. Black women have to be strong. They can't be weak. And when they are weak and they do express their emotions, they are labeled as angry Black women, which creates a cycle of Black women silencing their pain. And while this is the reality for many Black women, and I had to address this, I am very fortunate that at my institution, I have not had this experience, and I've had a very positive experience. This past year, I was diagnosed with a chronic illness, and I was fortunate enough to have a really good support system at Palm Beach Atlantic. One day, I was so down in the dumps, not being able to practice, just sitting in the training room, like watching my team go out to practice. And our athletic trainer noticed that I wasn't doing well, literally got up in the middle of like 3 other team sports practices and drove me to the school counselor to go talk to someone. So that's been like a great experience for me. Another reason why I think I haven't had a negative experience at my school is because there are many Black women in power. That athletic trainer I just mentioned, she was a Black woman. Our athletic director is a Black woman. So I have a lot of representation, and it's something that has made me feel empowered and has just given me like a great experience overall. So
Thank you for sharing. That hits close to home in my heart, hearing the story about your athletic trainer. And I'm so happy that you've had that kind of support. So let's shift a little bit, just a little bit. And I wanted to share that recently the NCAA presented results, as Dr. Hainline mentioned, from a few large studies examining mental health in student athletes during the pandemic. And they found student athletes of color in particular reported higher prevalence of mental health distress. Marquetta, let's hear from you. How can we better support student athletes of color when it comes to mental well-being?
I think Michaela just did a great job of segueing this conversation. And you're talking about the medical field, and you're talking about things like distrust of the medical field when it comes to African-American and BIPOC people in general. All of these things are factors here. Just thinking of the statistics, I think the main thing and one of the most important things that we can do is we should educate ourselves and understand that sports at the end of the day is a byproduct of the people that we are here to serve, and that's our student athletes. It is a very minute part of the day. It may be a huge part of their life in general, but it is a small part of the day as a student athlete. And we should educate ourselves on the issues and the things that matter to them outside of just their sport. And once we educate ourselves on those things, let's be specific. What are the things that our African-American communities are suffering from? The healthcare disparities, those things are important. What are those things that make up all of the things that we hear? Start to investigate those things. Don't just hear them. Like, why is the Black community, where's this health disparity coming from? Educate yourselves on those things. It's important. These are the people that you're serving. You know what I mean? And that's, educate yourself on those things, and also the personal lives of your student athletes. And if you're a person of color, Michaela, shout out to the women of color in your life. At that institution, we have to continue to advocate. If you are in a position of power, you have to advocate. You're in a position to create solutions, to be a part of changing the systems. And that is sometimes it's a load to carry, it's a burden to carry. And we should definitely check on those who carry that load as well. And most importantly, us that carry that load, that's why I repeatedly go back to, I have to prioritize my own mental health, because if people weren't educated on what you said, Michaela, about, that fact that Black women, a lot of times suffer silently, even though we're screaming and saying, hey, something is wrong, and no one hears us, and it feels like we're silent because we're just not heard. When you know that, you extend a different level of grace, you extend a different level of understanding. And by extending that different level of grace and understanding, you immediately impact somebody's mental wellness. That's less stress, that's less anxiety. Just simply understanding creates less stress. And if you want to go scientifically, less chemicals, that we're putting, certain chemicals that we put out in our bodies, like those things matter. What we put into our bodies, those things matter. Since we're talking about COVID, how's our immune system looking? That's something we can absolutely correlate to athletics. Nutrition is important. It's not just important for your physical body, but it's also important for your immune system. It's also important for your brain health. And so that's what I mean by educate ourselves outside of just the sport. My student athletes probably get tired of me talking about everything but just basketball. And because I correlate everything to life, I correlate everything to basketball to life, and sometimes they get to the point they're like, Coach, like, we get it. You want us ready for life? Like, yes, I do. That's my job. It's literally, I take it as my job. So educating myself beyond sport to support the people that I serve, I think that's important. And a lot of young women that I serve happen to be young women of color, in the athletic department, on my team. And so for me, it is very important for me to have an understanding beyond just my personal experiences.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. That was really powerful. I think two key things that I really took away as well is listening and advocating. And I'd also say, if you're at an institution and you feel like, well, I haven't heard from my student athletes of color, then you really need to evaluate what kind of spaces you've created to engage your student athletes of color and any other minoritized groups so that you can create an environment where these conversations can be had and we can start to and continue to address those issues and disparities. Thank you, Marquetta, for sharing that. Dr. Chu, same question for you. How can we better support our student athletes of color and their mental health?
So this is actually my wheelhouse, but to have me follow those two puts me at a major disadvantage.
I know, I'm sorry.
So, I love the question. And let me start off by saying this, and hopefully it makes sense to some of you, and maybe it won't. But if you only see me when you see me, then you don't really see me, right? That's what it comes down to. A lot of the spaces that we go into, right? How intentional are we being when it comes to addressing our students of color or our diverse students? How intentional are we being when it comes to making sure that there are services or resources or things available to the students in our communities to make sure that they have what they need, right? So, I love the fact that when Michaela says that, that one of these people recognized what was going on with her, right? How many of our students would have had that available to them? How many of our students would have had access to somebody who can pick up on some of the nuances because they are culturally aware and they're socially aware enough to recognize that something is going on with somebody, right? Sometimes when I've consulted with people, when I've talked to different departments, when I've, discussed things, sometimes when we talk about things like bringing in diverse providers, our first thought is, people have called and said, well, we're looking at bringing in somebody to work with our football and our men's basketball team. Well, really, what about all those other diverse student athletes you have on your campus? What about all those other people that may need services just as much as that one group, right? So if we're going to do this, we need to make sure that we're doing it in such a way that we're wanting to address as broad a population of students as possible, right? But I'm going to say something that it sounds simple, right? There are not enough diverse providers out there. Not only that, there are not enough diverse psychologists in some of these spaces, right? And there won't be for a long time. But mental health issues are so off the charts right now that everybody wants to be able to have someone who can come in and work with these different populations. Well, we're not going to always get that, right? But the other thing is, how many of your institutions would be open to say that you have enough diverse coaches, you have enough diverse administrators or people on campus? Some of our campuses can't even get people who are outside of athletics. So what makes you think you're going to get a specialized person in a specialized profession to come in and work with your athletes, right? So we have to start thinking about, are there other ways that we can connect with people? Are there other ways, other things that we can do to start addressing basic cultural competence so that we can start picking up on these things as well, right? Sometimes we get so caught up, and I'm gonna be user friendly here. I'm not gonna be as direct as I normally would be, right? But sometimes we get caught up in wanting cultural credibility more so than we want cultural competence, right? And what I mean by cultural credibility is, how many of you have heard that somebody say, well, I have a Black friend, and so, you know, I like, that's, you know, you want credibility. You don't want to be competent. And we need to start having the people who are working with our athletes be more understanding of this age range, the things and the pressures that they're dealing with, some of the backgrounds that they're coming from, right? I have told people, you know, being a Black man does not make me an expert on Black people. There are different cultures and subcultures across the country in different parts of the South and the North, you know, so we have to understand that in order to meet people where they are, we have to get off of our high horse and be where they are. We have to engage them. We have to, you know, when I said I did the legwork, right? I can tell you that if I could go to a practice, if I could go to a meeting, if I could go to, like, I was out there, you know, to be as available as possible, because as I told you in our conversation earlier, it's almost like those individuals who go out and live with the wolves or the bears, right? You go and you're in their space, and at first they look at you all weird, like, I'm not going to touch this person, right? But after a while, they become comfortable and they want to approach and they want to have some discussions and things like that. And sometimes those little side discussions are enough to open up bigger discussions, right? So we have to start thinking, are there other ways that we can really get down and engage people, make services available, right? Michaela, when she commented earlier about access to services, diverse individuals across the board tend to utilize the mental health services lower than most other groups, right? I can tell you that here at Indiana State University, they overutilize. So about 15 to 16% of our student population is African American. They usually make up 20 to 23% of the students using our counseling center. Why? Because we met them where they are. We don't mind engaging them, right? And we're not, it's not instant just us being judgmental or whatever. You do the work, they will come, right? But once again, the same quote, if you only see me when you see me, then you really don't see me. And I'm going to shut up because I don't want to take over.
No, that is so fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Chu. And I actually wrote that one down because that's really powerful and speaks to, the climate that I think some institutions may be living in right now and student athletes may be experiencing. And I would agree. I'll throw out a statistic there as far as access to mental health providers. There's a huge shortage across the board in mental health providers in our country. And in particular, psychiatrists. Right now, 55% of counties in the US do not have a practicing psychiatrist. There's a major shortage in access to mental health care. And so in the meantime, while hopefully that starts to change as we advocate for funding towards mental health care and education around mental health care. We need to get everyone on board and up to speed, and really having those conversations, like you mentioned, around not just mental health, but around diversity, racism, practicing anti-racism, and doing that kind of work. And so I would implore you, if you're in an athletics department or you're a student athlete at your university, ask yourself, am I a part of these conversations? And are these conversations happening in our department at our tables? And if they're not, then you're missing the boat big time. So thank you so much for that, Dr. Chu. So we're going to shift to another topic, very related. So within the past year, we have seen student athletes report their struggles with mental health, and many lose their lives to suicide. How can we begin to create an open, safe, and honest dialogue addressing the urgency surrounding mental health distress and suicide in athletes? Dr. Chu, let's start with you.
So I think that this is a really interesting question and a really interesting social phenomena that's happened in the last couple of years, right? Keep in mind that the risk of suicide, completion of suicide, mental health issues, these are not new, okay? What's happened is kind of the same thing that happened with George Floyd and COVID and some other things, but what's happened is we were forced to slow down and to reassess a lot of the things that we deal with and a lot of the things that we go through, right? And so not only did we realize that there was a spike as it related to COVID and being isolated, okay? All of a sudden, student athletes in general are taking a greater sense of agency, or they have a greater sense of agency when it comes to talking about and discussing these things, right? Suicide was around 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I remember, having side discussions about things that have happened among athletes and suicides years ago. But nowadays, these things right here are some of the most powerful tools that we have to us. And if something happens, it's public. Everything gets out there very quickly. And the realization that we've had more higher profile incidents that have popped up recently makes it sound like all of a sudden there's this major wave of an increased incidence, right? Well, suicide has been on the rise for the last few years before this. This is not just related to this one thing. It's not just only happening within athletics, that's happening across the board, right? And so we have to take the time and once again, meet students where they are. I will tell you that as the counseling center director, okay, there are a lot of things that I really appreciate, having the separation and all this other stuff. That's great. But the other part of that is when it comes to work with athletics, all of you in the audience right now, you serve as the gatekeepers. You serve as those people who are going to pick up on the red flags. You're going to see things related to mental health way before I do, right? And so if we can go out and do a training with sport medicine or residential life or with the coaches or whomever to make you aware of what a student may seem like when they're distressed or when they're struggling, that takes a heck of a lot of work off of me because you're going to put eyes on them way before I do, okay? And so I would encourage you that if you haven't done so already, that you should make it a priority that individuals in your department, especially individuals who have frequent contact with students, are doing, something like some, mental health first aid or QPR training or something so that when students are struggling, that you can make an easy referral, that you can pick up on that. One of the most important things you can do is take some time to get to know the people you're working with, to get to know the students that you're working with. Don't look at them as the product, look at them as the person. And when that person is struggling, when that person is not acting what seems to be normal for them, then maybe that's the time that you need to speak up so that they can get some assistance.
Those are great points. Thank you. Michaela, what are your thoughts? And then Marquetta, we'll wrap up with you.
Yeah. So when we talk about having an open and honest dialogue, I think we need to talk about stigma and how we can minimize the stigma so that we can have open and honest dialogue. But when we talk about stigma and the stigma of mental health, I think we talk about it too broadly. I believe that there are different levels of what is stigmatized specifically within the athletic community. And a big one is who deserves to be mentally unwell. Katie Meyer was a standout goalie on Stanford's soccer team and a key player that helped lead her team to a national championship in 2019. Katie Meyer was a national champion. Katie Meyer was called up to U.S. youth national teams. Katie Meyer had thousands and thousands of followers on Instagram because of the high status that she held at her prestigious university. And Katie Meyer died by suicide earlier this year. I feel like we fail to check on our high-performing athletes because why would a national champion have anything to be upset about? I feel like we forget that it doesn't matter for some people how successful they are because it's not big enough to fill a bigger void in their life. And when they are successful and this void just grows bigger and no one checks up on them because we assume that they're fine because they're successful, they equate that to people not caring about them. If we're going to address the stigma, if we're going to have an open and honest dialogue, we need to first identify the fact that there are individual working and moving pieces to the stigma, and we need to identify them and chip away at them. And when we do that, that's how we can increase the conversation and make it it'll never be an easy topic to talk about, but a topic that is more widely talked about, which is what we need, because we are going through an epidemic right now. Like, this is not okay. There should not be this many student athletes feeling so overwhelmed that the only choice they have is to complete suicide. It's not okay. So we need to talk about it, and we need to focus on the fact that there are different aspects to it, and it's not just one big stigma. So sorry, got a little passionate there.
Oh, that was great. Thank you so much, Michaela. And it's also hard to believe that you don't already have a degree in psychology, but your future students that you'll be educating are really lucky. So thank you. Marquetta, how about you?
Again, wow. It's sorry, Michaela, that was very triggering. As a high profile athlete myself, I understand. And that's one of the things that we really talk about is once for a lot of athletes, that is our lives, especially those of us who go pro, that is our lives. And so like we have to have conversations about failure. We teach how to win. We coach how to win. We don't coach how to fail, but we're going to have more L's in life than we are W's. That's just a fact. And I teach my athletes to win the war, not the battle. That's what we teach. We're gonna lose some battles, but we're gonna win the war, and the war is life. And so, that is from just again, as athletes, high profile athletes, don't matter, because when we're little, when we're kids, when our brain is developing, we're not training it. We're all training to be pro most of the time. At least the people who train us are training us in that manner. And they're training us to compartmentalize and to win. And we do the same things as we leave the sport and while we're in the sport. And even more so at that higher level, you got to think about the stress the coaches are on at that level too. That stress goes somewhere. It's not intentional. I know it's not intentional, but it does. Those athletes feel it unintentionally. For me, that's why I'm such a huge stickler and coaches about us making sure that our mental health is where it needs to be so that we can be there for our student athletes and that stress is not from the top down. Our student athletes have enough of their own to deal with, you know what I mean? And I've found just in my experience, the more that I can be there for my student athlete, and this is me as a student athlete, and this is just my experience and what really inspired me to coach. It was everything that Coach Chow gave to us as student athletes, the advice, the support. When it was her turn to receive it, we were there without a question. She didn't have to worry about winning the game to keep her job. She didn't have to worry about that because she took care of us as individuals. Therefore, we took care of her. And so that is the thing that I make sure that my athletes know, which is also why I have a career outside of a coach. So I don't have to put that type of stress on my student athletes to win, even at the Division III level. Even though we are definitely not in a space where, hey, if you lose, you're out in 2 years, and those type of things. But I understand. I was a Division I coach as well and an athlete, so I understand that pressure. I get it. I do. I really, really do, and I empathize with my coaches. But at the same time, we signed up for this. And so there's a certain level of accountability that we must take and we must have in ownership, because I will feel very, very bad, to have a conversation with the parent and not feel like I didn't do all in my power to make sure that their baby was okay. Because I know my mom was, you take care of my baby. You know what I mean? Take care of my baby. And when you're dealing with people of color, trust is important. It's one of the most important things. Social capital is important, and social capital comes from being authentic and genuine and who you are. And I think that is where we build the conversation and being able to meet people where they are and let them know that it's okay to fail sometimes. And I think that translates over, like you're gonna fail. And if we get used to failing and bouncing back, then that's a different kind of conversation. Now we can go into more of the coping skills of how to fail. What happens when you fail? How do you bounce back? How do you have those conversations? Because not everybody wants to be seen. Not everybody wants to be vulnerable. How do you make that person feel comfortable? You have to meet them where they are. Well, how do you meet them where they are? And so I agree, like it's very, very complicated. It's like, a lot of what if, or how this, how that. I think, but we have to start with ourselves and educating ourselves. Number one, we have to say that it is a priority, because everything that we say we prioritize as coaches, we get done. If we say we're going to fix that defense, we're in practice 30 minutes late until we figure it out. And so I think it needs to be the same intensity and passion for, the care that we give our young people. Because I promise you, the more you pour into them, they feel it, they know it's genuine, and they're going to pour it back into you. And it's just a beautiful circle to be a part of. And I'd rather be a part of that cycle, because I never want to walk into a gym a day in my life. I'll never forget walking into a gym as a Division I recruiter and a high school coach telling their kid that, she had tweaked her ankle, that we wouldn't care. And that broke my heart. And I'm like, dang, that's the image we got, that we don't care. Like, we just care about your performance, like wrap it up and let's go. Like, I get what he was trying to say, like be tough and so on and so forth. But that still sent chills through my body. And that was probably almost 10 years ago now. I never, ever want to be seen, or our coaches be seen in that light where we don't care. But he had to get that image from somewhere. And so I just want to be a part of the change and the solution. And so we have to continue to talk. We have to continue to share our personal stories. So Michaela, again, thank you for that. We have to continue to be advocates for ourselves first and foremost, and then for the people who don't want to be seen.
Thank you so much, Marquetta. I am almost speechless, which is hard for me to say, but that was incredible and really powerful from all three of you. And I will say, thank you for being your authentic selves and open and honest here in this space, and for your student athletes and your teammates, Michaela, because they're very lucky to have you. So I think we have time for maybe one question or two questions, because we went a little over there, which is fine because that was phenomenal. So I will look for some of the questions in the Q&A here if y'all want to go ahead and send that. We have one question here. How much pressure do student athletes face to build a brand? And how does this limit their ability to be authentic and address their struggles? Michaela, why don't you take that one? What do you think?
I'm sorry, I couldn't see that and I was looking for it, so I didn't really, can you say it again?
Yeah. So how much pressure do student athletes face to build a brand? And how does this limit their ability to be authentic and address their struggles?
Yeah, so this is a great question for me because I unfortunately-ish am very like image-based. And when I got to college, I was like, I have to put on this perfect image. I want everyone to think that I'm pretty and I'm a good athlete and I'm funny and this, that, and the other. And it was really hard for me to just be open and honest, like when things were going bad. So when I struggled, going into this past year, junior year, I was struggling a lot with anxiety because I just didn't want to talk to anyone about it. I just wanted everyone to think that I was a good player and that I was very social and that I was impressive. And I didn't want to share that I was actually going through something a lot deeper than what I would let on to. So it makes it really hard. And I think that it's just a part of being an athlete. We are taught from a young age, like what Marquetta was saying, like, you have a sprained ankle, like no one cares. Like, you need water, like no you don't. Like, you can go on without water, like you don't need a water break. And so like that whole I don't need a water break like bleeds into like our lives, like moving forward. Like, I don't need to tell people that I'm struggling because I am just supposed to suck it up and move on, because that's what I need to do as an athlete, because that portrays the fact that I'm strong and that I'm strong-willed, I'm not weak, and the last thing you want to be is weak. So I think that starts from young ages, like when we are bringing children up through athletics and when kids are starting sports at a young age. Why are we nationally ranking 6-year-olds? Like, why are we doing that? Like, go kick a ball, go hit a ball at the bat. That's what it's supposed to be. When we get older, we get more serious, but we need to instill in them from a young age, like, it is a game, have fun. If you want to make the choice moving forward to be more serious about it, that is your choice and that is okay. But your mental health is not less important than your performance on the field, and who you are as a person is not less important than the image that you portray.
Amen. Thank you so much for that, Michaela. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I wish that we weren't, because I really think we could probably continue this panel for another hour. And I do think that our panelists would be willing to do that. So feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any further questions. Thank you so much to Dr. Hainline, Marquetta, Michaela, and Dr. Chu for your insight and honest answers today. And thank you to our participants for joining us in this really important conversation. The NCAA has provided resources that you as athletic administrators can apply on your campus. The Sports Science Institute has created the Mental Health Workshop Planning Kit, which helps conference offices support their member schools in implementing mental health best practices. These resources can be found on ncaa.org. If you have not accessed these materials, we really urge you to do so. Also, check frequently with the Sports Science Institute website for more updates and resources regarding student-athlete mental wellness. Now we'll take a 10-minute break. Inclusion Forum programming will resume at 4:45 Eastern Standard Time with the keynote session, It's Time, Kicking Glass, Breaking Barriers, and Inspiring Social Change with basketball legend, entrepreneur, and NBA broadcast analyst, Candace Parker. Thank you so much again to our panelists and our audience for joining us. Take care.